Now, before we can actually make the player jump, we're going to need to know when the player is actually standing on something solid. In this case, we're going to build the most basic class that'll manage whether the player is in motion or if the player is being stopped by another physical object. Let's go into our scripts folder and create a new C# script called input state. Then let's open this up in MonoDevelop. Now, the idea behind the input state is that we're going to have any script that needs to change the motion or the movement of the player looking at the input state to determine what the actual physical state of the player is. In this class, we're going to keep track of the absolute x and y values of the velocity of the player. We're going to note when the player is standing, and we're also going to keep track of when any type of input has taken place. In this case, whatever button makes our player jump. So let's start adding these properties to the class. We'll make a public boolean to represent the action button. Next, we'll need a public float that'll represent the absolute velocity x value. And let's set this to 0. Now we can copy this line and paste it below and change this to y. Below this, we'll need a public boolean. This will represent whether we're standing or not. And the last, we'll need to keep track of the threshold between when the velocity is slowing down and when we determine he's actually standing. In this case, let's make it a public float, and we'll call it standing threshold. And let's set this value to equal 1. Next, we'll create an awake method. In order for us to keep track of the player's velocity, we're actually going to need a reference to its rigid body. Let's create a private property. We'll type this to rigid body 2D and just call this body 2D. Inside of our awake, we'll add a reference to the body 2D by getting the component of the rigid body. We're not going to use the start method, so let's remove this. And inside of update, we're going to want to test whether any key has been pressed and set this to our action button. So let's do action button equals input any key down. Now, Unity's input system is a little bit more complicated than this example we're setting up. But because we want to build a simple game where at any button you press, whether it be the mouse button or any key on the keyboard, will allow our player to jump, we're just going to use this catch-all property on the input class to make this detection and decide whether the action button is pressed or not. The final thing we're going to need to do is calculate when the player is standing or not. In this case, let's create our fixed update method. Remember, all of our physics calculations should always go in fixed update instead of in update. And here we're simply going to calculate the absolute value of our velocity. The reason we use the absolute value is that the player could either be moving up or down or left or right, and those values range from positive to negative since the 0, 0 position is in the middle of the screen in Unity. We don't really care which direction the player is actually moving. What we want to make sure is that there's actually movement instead. So what we'll do is we'll convert any of these values into their absolute value, making them always positive. Here we'll set absolute velocity x to equal system, math, absolute value, and here we'll get the velocity x from the body. Now let's copy this line and paste it below, changing x to y, so we also get the absolute value of the y position. Now from here, we're going to test whether the player is standing or not. We can do a simple test to see if the absolute value y is less than our standing threshold. We'll set the standing value to equal absolute value y being less than or equal to standing threshold. Now, this isn't the best way to actually calculate this, but since this game is so simple, we can get away with it. Normally, when you'd want to detect if the player is standing on something solid, we would use some type of collider that looks for a collision with the floor. Here, we're simply just going to see that if we're not moving on the y-axis, we're just going to consider that we're standing on something. Now let's save this script, go back into our game, and add the input state onto our player. If we select our player and take a look, you'll see we now have the input state. Let's pause the game, play it, and step through it frame at a time. As we step through, you'll see the absolute value y is increasing because we're moving faster as we fall down. As we get closer to the ground, let's take a look at what happens to the absolute value of y and the standing Boolean. Here you'll see we hit the ground, the value goes to 0, and standing is now true. At this point, we now have a way of detecting that our player is falling and that he hits the ground. Coming up next, we'll make the player jump.